This is a story about obsession, delusion, and the moment when reality crashes into fantasy like a freight train. It happened at LAX airport on a cold February night in 2023, when the terminal lights buzzed with that sickly yellow glow that makes everything feel like purgatory. Marcus Chen, a 26-year-old social media influencer from Portland, had been following the Depp case like it was his personal religion. He'd built his entire online persona around defending Amber Heard, gaining over 150,000 followers who hung on his every word about the truth of domestic abuse and Hollywood corruption. His content was aggressive, passionate, and completely one-sided. Meanwhile, Johnny Depp, now 60 and visibly weathered by years of brutal legal battles and public humiliation, was just trying to catch a red-eye flight to New York. He'd been doing this for months, traveling alone, keeping a low profile, avoiding the spotlight that had once defined his glittering career. The airport was nearly empty at 2 a.m., just scattered travelers and tired cleaning crews going about their business. Marcus had been waiting for hours, having somehow discovered Depp's travel plans through obsessive social media stalking and airport employee contacts. This was his moment to become internet famous, to confront the man he'd painted as a monster to his devoted followers. Tonight, everything would change for both of them. Marcus had been pacing the terminal for 3 hours, his phone fully charged, his confrontation speech rehearsed to perfection. He'd even brought a small camera crew, 2 friends he'd convinced to film what he dramatically called his moment of justice against Hollywood abuse. His social media had been building up to this for weeks with increasingly aggressive posts, getting ready to confront an abuser. Some people need to be held accountable. Truth will prevail when cowards are exposed. His followers were expecting content, expecting him to deliver on his promises of confrontation and justice. When he finally spotted Johnny walking through the terminal, Marcus felt his heart race with adrenaline and righteous fury. But something was wrong with the picture he'd painted in his mind over months of obsession. The man walking toward him didn't look like a powerful Hollywood predator or confident movie star. He looked like someone's broken grandfather, shoulders hunched under an invisible weight, moving slowly and deliberately, clearly exhausted from whatever burden he was carrying. His clothes were simple, unremarkable. No entourage, no security detail, no signs of the wealth and power Marcus had imagined. For a split second, Marcus hesitated. This wasn't the confident, menacing figure he'd expected to confront. But his phone was recording, his friends were watching, and his followers were waiting for content. The narrative he'd built his entire career on couldn't crumble now. He'd gone too far to turn back. Johnny Depp, Marcus screamed at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing through the terminal like a gunshot that shattered the peaceful late-night atmosphere. Every head in the vicinity turned to stare. Johnny stopped walking, looking up with tired, confused eyes that seemed to search for the source of the hostility. "You're a piece of shit. You destroyed Amber's life, you pathetic abuser." The words came out like machine gun fire, months of rehearsed rage and built-up resentment exploding in a verbal assault. Marcus was filming everything on his phone, his hands shaking with adrenaline and excitement. This was it, his viral moment. Look at him. Everyone. Look at this coward who beats women and thinks he can just walk around free. Johnny just stood there, not moving, not defending himself, not even trying to walk away. His silence only fueled Marcus's fury and made him feel more powerful. "Say something. Defend yourself, you pathetic has-been. You think your money and lawyers can protect you from the truth?" Other passengers were staring now, some pulling out their own phones to record the confrontation. A security guard started jogging over from across the terminal. But Marcus couldn't stop, wouldn't stop. This was his moment, his chance to go viral, to prove to his followers that he was the hero of this story. "You think your money can buy you out of anything? You're nothing. Nothing." His voice cracked with the intensity of his own performance. Johnny's eyes never left his face, and in them was something that didn't match the narrative Marcus had built. But he was too far gone to see it. "Are you finished?" Johnny's voice was quiet, almost gentle, like a parent addressing a child having a tantrum. The contrast was jarring. Marcus screaming like a deranged lunatic, Johnny responding with the calm patience of someone who'd been through this before. That wasn't the script Marcus had written in his head during months of planning. "You don't even know me," Johnny continued, his words barely audible over the terminal's ambient noise and Marcus's heavy breathing. "You don't know what really happened behind closed doors. I know enough. Marcus shrieked, his voice reaching an almost hysterical pitch that made several passengers step back. I watched every second of that trial. I heard all the evidence. I know you're a monster who destroys women. Johnny took a step closer, and Marcus could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his weathered face, the way his hands trembled slightly. Did you watch all of it? Did you hear all the recordings? The real ones that weren't edited? Something in his tone was wrong, off script. This wasn't how abusers were supposed to act according to Marcus's research. They were supposed to be defensive, angry, threatening. Not sad. I don't need to hear your lies and manipulation, Marcus shouted, but his voice wavered slightly for the first time. You ruined her career, her life, her future. Johnny nodded slowly, like he was considering the accusation carefully. Yeah, I thought that too. For years, I thought I was the monster she said I was. I believed her completely. I almost destroyed myself believing her version of events. The security guard reached them, but Johnny held up a hand. It's okay, he told the guard calmly. We're just talking. The video went viral within hours, but not in the way Marcus had planned or hoped. He posted it immediately after returning to his hotel, expecting praise and celebration from his followers, expecting to be hailed as a hero who'd confronted an abuser. Instead, the comments were brutal and devastating. This guy is completely unhinged. Leave the man alone. This is harassment. This is exactly what's wrong with cancel culture. Even his most loyal followers were turning on him, disgusted by what they saw. The video showed exactly what had happened. A young man screaming hysterically at an older man who responded with nothing but tired sadness and patience. Marcus looked like exactly what he was, a deranged fanatic attacking a stranger in an airport. His follower count began plummeting immediately. Sponsors started dropping him within hours. His friends stopped answering his calls and texts. The comment section became a battleground of people defending Johnny and attacking Marcus's behavior. But worse than the public humiliation and financial ruin was the growing realization that maybe, just maybe, he'd been completely wrong about everything. He started researching again, this time looking for evidence that would vindicate his actions and restore his reputation. Instead, he found audio recordings he deliberately ignored, testimonies he dismissed because they didn't fit his narrative, evidence that painted a completely different picture of the relationship. His hero, his idol, the woman he defended so fiercely and built his career around, began to crumble under objective scrutiny. And Johnny Depp, the man he'd verbally assaulted and humiliated, looked more and more like the actual victim. The shame was overwhelming, but admitting he was wrong would mean admitting his entire online persona was built on lies and manipulation. Marcus spent the next week locked in his apartment, obsessively reading court documents and watching footage he'd previously ignored or dismissed. The evidence was damning, not for Johnny, but for Amber Heard. Audio recordings where she clearly admitted to hitting him, throwing objects at him, manipulating situations to make him look like the aggressor. Witness testimonies that directly contradicted her story. Photos that appeared to be doctored or staged. Text messages that showed her planning false accusations. His entire worldview was collapsing piece by piece, but he couldn't bring himself to post a retraction or apology. His remaining followers were the hardcore believers, the ones who would turn on him viciously the moment he admitted doubt or showed weakness. He built his career on being the voice of justice, the man who stood up for abuse victims against powerful Hollywood predators. Admitting he was wrong would mean admitting he'd become the abuser himself, that he'd harassed an innocent man. He started drinking heavily, spending entire days scrolling through social media, watching as his airport confrontation was dissected by legal experts, body language analysts, and social media commentators. They all reached the same conclusion. He was a delusional fanatic who'd harassed an innocent man based on false information. The irony wasn't lost on him. In trying to fight abuse and stand up for victims, he'd become the abuser himself. But his pride, his reputation, his entire identity was built on being right, on being the hero. How could he possibly admit he was wrong? How could he face the truth about what he'd become? The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in, and the weight of his actions was becoming unbearable. 3 weeks after the airport incident, Marcus sat in his empty apartment, staring at his phone like it held the key to his salvation. He'd lost everything. His followers, his income, his reputation, his friends, his sense of self. The video had been viewed millions of times, but not for the reasons he'd hoped. He'd become internet famous all right, but as a cautionary tale about online obsession and mob mentality. His options were limited and both terrifying. He could double down, insist he was right despite mounting evidence, and fade into obscurity as a delusional conspiracy theorist surrounded by increasingly toxic echo chambers. Or he could do something unprecedented in the age of social media, admit he was completely wrong, apologize publicly, and try to rebuild his life with honesty instead of delusion and performance. The second option terrified him more than the first because it would mean facing the truth about what he'd become, acknowledging that he'd verbally assaulted an innocent man, and accepting that his entire online persona was built on lies and manipulation. But continuing down his current path meant living in a fantasy world, surrounded by increasingly toxic people who would enable his delusions. He picked up his phone with shaking hands and started typing a message to Johnny Depp's representatives, his heart pounding with fear and shame. It was time to face the music, even if it destroyed what was left of his reputation and self-respect. The truth had to come out, no matter how much it hurt. The message took Marcus 3 hours to write, delete, and rewrite multiple times. His hands shook as he typed. "Mr. Depp, I'm the person who confronted you at LAX 3 weeks ago. I've since reviewed all the evidence from your trial, and I realize I was completely wrong about everything. I would like to apologize to you in person if you're willing to meet with me. I understand completely if you refuse." He sent it before he could change his mind or chicken out. The response came 2 days later, not from Johnny's representatives or lawyers, but from the man himself. The message was simple. "Kid, I appreciate the message. I'll be in LA next week. Coffee." Marcus stared at the text in complete disbelief. After everything he'd done, after the humiliation and harassment, after the public attack and viral video, Johnny was willing to meet with him. The kindness in that simple response made Marcus feel even worse about his actions. He'd spent months painting this man as a monster, building content around the idea that he was a dangerous abuser, when in reality, he was showing more grace and forgiveness than Marcus had ever shown anyone in his life. The week passed slowly, filled with anxiety, shame, and sleepless nights. Marcus had no idea what he would say, how he could possibly apologize for what he'd done, or whether he deserved any kind of forgiveness. But for the first time in months, he felt like he might have a chance at redemption, at making things right. The coffee meeting felt like his last hope for becoming human again. The coffee shop was small and quiet, tucked away in a corner of West Hollywood where celebrities could meet without being harassed by paparazzi or fans. Marcus arrived early, his hands shaking with nerves and his stomach churning with anxiety. When Johnny walked in, he looked completely different from the broken man at the airport. Not the confident movie star either, but just a regular person wearing jeans and a simple t-shirt, looking like someone's dad running errands. He sat down across from Marcus without fanfare or security. "So," Johnny said, stirring his coffee calmly, "what changed your mind?" Marcus had rehearsed this moment countless times, but now that it was here, words completely failed him. I watched the recordings. All of them. The ones I'd ignored before. I realized I'd been wrong about everything." Johnny nodded thoughtfully. "It's hard to admit when we're wrong, especially when we've been so public about being right. Takes real courage." Then he said something that completely floored Marcus and shattered his remaining assumptions. "I was wrong too. You know, for years, I believed her version of events. I thought I was the problem, that I was the abuser she said I was. I almost killed myself believing her lies." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy and profound. Marcus realized he wasn't the only one who'd been manipulated by Amber Heard's carefully crafted narrative. Even Johnny had believed it for a while, had internalized the abuse and blamed himself. They were both victims of the same manipulation, the same lies, the same carefully constructed false reality. "I destroyed you," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the coffee shop's quiet background music. "I stood there and screamed at you like a lunatic, and you just took it. You didn't fight back, didn't defend yourself, didn't even try to walk away. Why?" Johnny was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully. "Because I've been where you are. I've been so convinced I was right, so sure of my own narrative, that I couldn't see the truth right in front of me. Anger makes us blind, kid. It makes us do things we never thought we'd do." Tears started flowing down Marcus's face, hot and shameful. "I became everything I claimed to hate. I became the abuser. I harassed you, humiliated you, tried to destroy your reputation based on lies I chose to believe. How can you even sit here with me?" Johnny reached across the table and gently touched Marcus's arm. "Because everyone deserves a chance to make things right. You realized you were wrong, and you had the courage to admit it. That's more than most people do in this situation. The kindness in his voice broke something fundamental inside Marcus. All the anger, all the hate, all the toxic obsession he'd carried for months came pouring out in uncontrollable tears. For the first time since the airport incident, he felt genuinely human again. Flawed, broken, ashamed, but human. "I don't know how to come back from this," Marcus sobbed. "I don't know how to be a person again after becoming a monster." Johnny squeezed his arm gently. "One day at a time, kid. One honest day at a time." "I want to make this right," Marcus said, wiping his eyes with shaking hands. "I want to post a video apologizing, explaining what really happened, telling the truth about everything. I want to expose the lies I spread." Johnny shook his head firmly. "Don't do it for me, kid. Don't do it to fix your reputation or get your followers back. Do it for yourself. Do it because it's the right thing to do, not because you think it'll solve your problems." Marcus nodded, understanding the distinction. "I know my career is over. I know I'll never get my followers back, never get my sponsors back, never be trusted again. But I can't keep living this lie. I can't keep pretending I was the hero when I was actually the villain of the story." "You weren't the villain," Johnny said gently but firmly. "You were a victim too. She manipulated all of us. Me, you, the media, millions of people around the world. The difference is, you had the courage to admit when you were wrong. That takes real strength." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of truth settling between them. "I'm going to therapy," Marcus said finally. "I need to figure out how I became so obsessed, so toxic, so willing to attack a stranger. I never want to be that person again." Johnny smiled, the first genuine smile Marcus had seen from him. "That's the best thing you could do. For yourself, and for anyone else who might be going down the same path you were on." As they prepared to leave, Johnny stood up and extended his hand. "Good luck, Marcus. I hope you find your way back to being the person you want to be." Marcus shook his hand, knowing it was probably the last time he'd see him, but grateful beyond words for the grace he'd been shown. Marcus posted the apology video a week later. It was 25 minutes long, completely unedited, raw, and brutally honest about everything. He admitted he was wrong, explained how he'd been manipulated, showed the evidence he'd ignored, and took full responsibility for his actions without making excuses. The response was mixed. Some people praised his honesty and courage. Others said it was too little, too late, just a desperate attempt to save his career. His remaining followers mostly abandoned him, but Marcus found he genuinely didn't care anymore. For the first time in years, he was telling the truth instead of performing for an audience. He got a job at a local coffee shop, started intensive therapy twice a week, and began rebuilding his life completely away from social media. The work was humbling, serving customers, cleaning tables, doing the mundane tasks that most people take for granted. But it was honest work, and honesty felt like a luxury after months of living in delusion and performance. He still thought about the airport incident every day, but now it served as a reminder of who he never wanted to be again. The shame was still there, would probably always be there, but it was accompanied by something else: gratitude. Gratitude that Johnny had shown him grace, that he'd been given a chance to make things right, and that he'd found the strength to walk away from toxic obsession. He started reading books about manipulation, about cults, about how ordinary people can be radicalized. He wanted to understand how he'd become so twisted, so willing to attack an innocent person. 6 months later, Marcus had learned some hard truths about himself and about the world that he wished he'd understood earlier. Social media had turned him into a monster, feeding his need for validation and outrage until he'd lost sight of basic human decency and critical thinking. He'd become addicted to being right, to being the voice of justice, to having an audience hang on his every word and validate his anger. But justice without truth isn't justice at all. It's just mob mentality dressed up in righteous language. He'd learned that heroes and villains rarely exist in real life, that most situations are complicated, and that the loudest voices are often the most wrong. He'd also learned that forgiveness is possible, even for the worst mistakes, but only if you're willing to face the truth about what you've done and commit to change. The hardest lesson was accepting that he'd been a victim of manipulation while simultaneously being responsible for his own actions. Amber Heard had crafted a narrative that fooled millions of people, but Marcus had chosen to act on that narrative without doing his due diligence. He'd chosen to attack rather than question, to perform rather than think, to build his identity around hatred rather than truth. Those choices were his alone, and he'd have to live with the consequences forever. But he'd also learned that redemption was possible, that people could change, that rock bottom could be the foundation for building something better. His therapist had helped him understand how he'd been vulnerable to manipulation, how his own insecurities and need for purpose had made him susceptible to false narratives that gave him a sense of importance and moral superiority. Sometimes, late at night when he couldn't sleep, Marcus would remember the exact look in Johnny's eyes at the airport. Not anger, not fear, not the defensive rage he'd expected, but profound sadness. The sadness of a man who'd been through hell and come out the other side, only to be confronted by yet another person who'd been fooled by the same lies that had nearly destroyed him. It was the look of someone who understood exactly what Marcus was going through, because he'd been there himself. Marcus realized now that Johnny had probably seen hundreds of people like him over the years, fans who'd been manipulated into believing a false narrative, who'd turned their pain and confusion into rage directed at the wrong person. The grace Johnny had shown him wasn't just kindness, it was recognition. Recognition of a fellow victim of manipulation, someone who'd been caught up in a web of lies and lashed out at the nearest target. That realization was both comforting and terrifying. Comforting because it meant he wasn't alone in his experience, that he wasn't uniquely evil or broken. Terrifying because it meant he'd become part of a larger pattern of abuse and manipulation that had been going on for years, that there were probably others out there just like him, ready to attack based on false information. The weight of that responsibility, knowing that his story could help prevent others from making the same mistakes, became part of his motivation for sharing his experience publicly, despite the shame and humiliation it brought him. A year after the airport incident, Marcus received an unexpected text from Johnny. "Saw your latest video about recognizing manipulation tactics. Good work. Keep helping people." Marcus had started a small YouTube channel focused on media literacy and recognizing manipulation in social media. He had only a few hundred subscribers, people who'd been through similar experiences, who'd been caught up in online mobs or toxic fandoms and wanted to learn how to think more critically. It wasn't glamorous work, and it didn't pay much, but it felt meaningful in a way his previous content never had. He was using his experience as a cautionary tale, helping others avoid the same mistakes he'd made. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd found his voice by admitting he'd been wrong, found his purpose by sharing his failures rather than his successes. He learned that real strength comes from vulnerability, real wisdom comes from admitting ignorance, and real justice comes from truth, not from the loudest voice in the room. The airport incident would always be part of his story, a reminder of how far he'd fallen and how much grace he'd been shown. But it was no longer the end of his story, it was the beginning of a better one. He'd started speaking at colleges about online radicalization, sharing his story with young people who were navigating the same toxic online spaces that had consumed him. Some of them thanked him afterward, saying his story had made them think twice about their own online behavior. Those moments made all the shame and humiliation worth it. If you've made it this far, thank you for listening to this story. It's a reminder that we all have the capacity for both cruelty and kindness, for both delusion and clarity, for both destruction and redemption. In an age of social media mobs and online outrage, it's more important than ever to pause, to question, to seek truth rather than validation. Marcus's story isn't unique. Countless people have been caught up in toxic fandoms, online harassment campaigns, and manipulation tactics designed to turn us against each other. But it's also a story of redemption, of the power of admitting when we're wrong, and of the grace that's possible when we choose truth over narrative. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever found yourself caught up in online outrage or toxic behavior, please consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell. We'll be sharing more stories like this, stories about real people facing real consequences for their online actions and finding ways to make things right. Because in the end, we're all just human beings trying to figure out how to treat each other with dignity and respect. And sometimes, that starts with admitting when we've failed to do exactly that. Don't let the algorithm decide what you believe. Don't let your emotions override your critical thinking. And remember, the person on the other side of your screen is human too, deserving of the same compassion you'd want for yourself. Until next time, stay critical, stay kind, and stay human.